Humans terrified the rest of the galaxy shitless, and there was a goddamn good reason why. Douglas Gordon marched into the massive Galactic Council chamber, his combat boots thudding on the polished metal floor. The room was dimly lit, representatives of different alien species seated in a semicircle around a central podium. Insectoid Cranium clicked their mandibles, reptilian saurians flicked their tongues, and the ethereal luminarians glowed softly. Korvac, the towering Krenim leader, fixed his compound eyes on Douglas. "Human, we have summoned you here because a grave threat looms over the galaxy. Zarthax, a rogue Krenim scientist, has stolen a prototype quantum nullifier weapon. If activated, it can erase entire star systems from existence." Douglas crossed his arms. "And you want me to clean up your mess because—" "Your species is known for resilience, adaptability, and unorthodox thinking, the very traits that make you unpredictable to the galactic community." Korvac's mandibles twitched. "You must retrieve the nullifier and neutralize Zarthax. But this mission is top secret. Widespread panic must be prevented. The continued existence of your species and access to advanced Council technology. Zarthax is protected by an army on a fortified space station. You'll be granted our best stealth ship and weapons." Korvac held out a spherical device. "This quantum key can deactivate the nullifier. The fate of countless lives depends on you, human." Douglas took the key, a grim smile on his face. The galaxy was about to learn what it meant to rely on a human to save its collective ass. This was why aliens feared his kind, and for damn good reason. When humans got involved, the universe trembled. Douglas powered up the Phantom's engines, punching in the coordinates for the Zelos system. He sat back in the pilot's chair, taking a deep breath. The weight of the mission settled heavily on his shoulders, but he pushed the doubts aside. He was the right man for the job, and he would see it through. As the ship hurtled through hyperspace, Douglas pored over the scant intelligence the Galactic Council had provided. Zarthax's space station schematics rotated on the holographic display, revealing a heavily fortified structure bristling with weapons emplacements and shielding. The Krenim scientist had spared no expense in securing his base of operations. The Phantom dropped out of hyperspace on the fringes of the Zelos system. Immediately, the ship's sensors lit up with warnings. A Krenim patrol fleet orbited the space station, their ships arrayed in a defensive formation. Douglas's fingers danced across the controls, activating the Phantom's cloaking device. The ship shimmered and vanished from sight, slipping past the patrol fleet undetected. Douglas guided the Phantom towards the space station's outer hull, searching for a suitable entry point. He found a maintenance airlock and maneuvered the ship into position. With a hiss of hydraulics, he extended the docking clamps and secured the Phantom to the station's hull. Donning his tactical gear, Douglas grabbed a plasma torch from the ship's armory. He cycled the airlock and stepped onto the station's hull, magnetic boots keeping him anchored. The torch flared to life, its white-hot flame cutting through the reinforced metal like butter. Within minutes, Douglas had carved an opening large enough to slip through. Inside the station, Douglas found himself in a dimly lit maintenance corridor. He consulted the schematics on his wrist-mounted display, plotting a route to Zarthax's likely location. He moved swiftly and silently, his enhanced senses alert for any signs of danger. The labyrinthine corridors twisted and turned, forcing Douglas to navigate carefully. He avoided patrols of Krenim soldiers and skirted around security drones, his cloaking suit rendering him nearly invisible. But as he approached the station's central core, an alarm suddenly pierced the air. Red lights flashed, and the sound of booted feet echoed through the corridors. Douglas pressed himself against a wall, his hand tightening on his blaster. A group of heavily armed Krenim soldiers rounded the corner, their weapons trained on his position. Douglas's eyes widened as he realized the soldiers were not carrying standard Krenim weapons. Instead, they wielded advanced energy rifles, their sleek black barrels glowing with an ominous red light. He barely had time to react as the soldiers opened fire, crimson bolts of energy sizzling through the air. The human operative dove for cover, his personal shield flickering under the onslaught. The energy bolts penetrated the shield, scorching the wall behind him. Douglas gritted his teeth, realizing that Zarthax had equipped his troops with weaponry designed to counter Council technology. But Douglas was not one to back down from a fight. He leaned out from behind cover, his own blaster spitting blue bolts of plasma. His superior training and lightning-fast reflexes gave him an edge, allowing him to outmaneuver the Krenim soldiers. The corridor erupted into a fierce firefight, energy bolts crisscrossing the space between the combatants. Douglas moved with fluid grace, dodging and weaving as he returned fire. One by one the Krenim soldiers fell, their armor smoking from the precise shots of the human operative. As the last soldier crumpled to the ground, Douglas paused to catch his breath. He approached one of the fallen Krenim and picked up an energy rifle, examining it closely. The weapon bore Zarthax's personal insignia, confirming that the rogue scientist had been developing his own advanced weaponry. Douglas's jaw tightened as he realized the implications. Zarthax was not just a thief, but a dangerous innovator. The quantum nullifier was likely just the tip of the iceberg when it came to the Krenim's destructive capabilities. With renewed urgency, Douglas pressed deeper into the station. The energy rifle now slung across his back. He knew he had to reach Zarthax before the quantum nullifier could be activated. The fate of countless lives hung in the balance, and failure was not an option. Douglas pushed deeper into the space station, his blaster at the ready. As he rounded another corner, he found himself face to face with a group of Krenim scientists. Their eyes widened with terror at the sight of the human soldier, and they immediately raised their hands in surrender. "Please don't shoot," one of the scientists pleaded, his voice trembling. "We're not armed, we just work here." Douglas kept his blaster trained on the group, his eyes narrowing. "I'm looking for Zarthax. Where is he?" The scientists exchanged nervous glances before one of them, a young Krenim with bright blue eyes, stepped forward. "I can help you find him. My name is Korax. I've worked closely with Zarthax, but I never agreed with his methods." Korax swallowed hard. Zarthax has become obsessed with the idea of Krenim's superiority. He rants about cleansing the galaxy of lesser species. He's been experimenting on captured aliens, using them as test subjects for his weapons. Douglas felt a wave of revulsion wash over him. The thought of innocent beings being used as guinea pigs for Zarthax's twisted experiments made his blood boil. "Take me to his lab, now." Korax nodded, and the group set off down the corridor. As they walked, Korax filled Douglas in on the layout of the station and the security measures Zarthax had put in place. But suddenly, a flicker of movement caught Douglas's eye. He shoved Korax aside just as a figure materialized out of thin air, a gleaming blade slicing through the space where the Krenim's head had been moments before. Douglas found himself surrounded by a group of elite guards, their bodies shimmering with advanced stealth technology. The Shadowblades, as Korax called them, were Zarthax's personal guard, trained in close-quarters combat and equipped with the latest in Krenim weaponry. They closed in on Douglas, their blades flashing in the dim light. Douglas holstered his blaster and raised his fists, falling into a fighting stance. The Shadowblades attacked as one, their movements swift and precise. But Douglas was faster. He dodged and weaved, his enhanced reflexes allowing him to stay one step ahead of their blades. He lashed out with a series of rapid strikes, his fists and feet finding their marks with devastating accuracy. The shadow blades fell one by one, their bodies crumpling to the floor, but not before they managed to land a few blows of their own. Douglas winced as he felt the sting of a blade across his ribs and the crunch of a fist connecting with his jaw. But he pushed through the pain, his focus never wavering. He had a mission to complete, and no amount of physical discomfort would stop him. As the last shadow blade fell, Douglas turned to Korax, who was staring at him with a mixture of awe and fear. "Impressive," the Krenim said. "I've never seen anyone fight like that." Korax led him to a secret passage, a narrow corridor hidden behind a false wall. They slipped inside, the entrance ceiling shut behind them. The passage bypassed the station's main security systems, allowing them to move undetected. As they approached Zarthax's lab, Douglas could feel the weight of the galaxy's fate pressing down on him. He knew that the confrontation with the rogue scientist would be the most important battle of his life. The quantum nullifier had to be secured, and Zarthax had to be stopped, no matter the cost. Douglas checked his weapons one last time, ensuring that everything was in working order. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. Then, with a nod to Corax, he stepped forward, ready to face whatever challenges Zarthax had in store. Douglas and Corax burst into Zarthax's lab, blasters at the ready. The cavernous room was a nightmarish blend of advanced technology and twisted experimentation. Strange machinery hummed and pulsed, casting an eerie glow over the space. Bubbling tanks lined the walls, each containing grotesque half-formed creatures that twitched and writhed in their artificial wombs. In the center of the lab stood Zarthax himself, a towering Krenim with a cybernetic eye that gleamed with malevolent intelligence. A cruel, twisted smile played across his scarred face as he held the quantum nullifier in his hands, the device pulsing with an ominous energy. "Ah, the human," Zarthax said, his voice dripping with mock admiration. "I must congratulate you on making it this far. Your tenacity and skill are truly impressive." Douglas kept his blaster trained on the rogue scientist, his finger hovering over the trigger. "It's over, Zarthax. Hand over the nullifier and surrender." Zarthax chuckled, a sound that sent chills down Douglas's spine. "Oh, but why would I do that? You see, I've been monitoring your progress through my station, and I must say I'm fascinated by you. Your kind has such potential, such raw power." The Krenim scientist took a step forward, his cybernetic eye whirring as it focused on Douglas. "Join me, human. Together we can purify this galaxy, rid it of the weak and unworthy. I will spare your Earth and grant humanity a place of honor in my new order." Disgust twisted in Douglas's gut at the offer. "Go to hell," he spat. "I'd rather die than join a madman like you." Zarthax's face contorted with rage, his grip tightening on the nullifier. "So be it," he snarled. "If you will not join me, then you will die with the rest of the vermin." With a flick of his wrist, Zarthax activated a force field around himself, a shimmering barrier that crackled with energy. At the same time, hidden doors along the lab's walls slid open, revealing a swarm of cybernetically enhanced Krenim warriors, each armed with a miniature version of the quantum nullifier. The warriors surged forward, their mechanical limbs whirring as they closed in on Douglas and Corax. Douglas opened fire, his blaster bolts ricocheting off the warriors' armored hides. Beside him, Corax frantically worked at a nearby console, his fingers flying over the keys as he tried to access the lab's systems. Douglas ducked and weaved, his enhanced reflexes allowing him to evade the warriors' attacks. He switched to the advanced energy rifle he had taken from the fallen soldiers, its crimson bolts tearing through the cybernetic abominations. Suddenly Corax let out a triumphant shout. "I've got it," he cried. "I've hacked into the lab's security systems. I can shut down the warriors' control chips." Corax's fingers danced across the console, and a moment later, the warriors jerked and spasmed, their cybernetic implants shorting out in a shower of sparks. They collapsed to the ground, twitching and writhing as their systems failed. But Zarthax was far from defeated. He snarled in rage, his force field still shimmering around him. Douglas scanned the barrier, searching for any weakness he could exploit. There, a small fluctuation in the field's energy output, a barely noticeable flicker. Douglas took aim with the energy rifle, pouring all his focus into the shot. The bolt struck the force field dead center, causing it to ripple and waver. For a moment it held, but then with a crackling hiss, it collapsed, leaving Zarthax exposed. Douglas charged forward, dropping his rifle and launching himself at the Krenim scientist. They collided in a tangle of limbs, grappling for control of the quantum nullifier. Zarthax was strong, his cybernetic enhancements giving him an edge in raw power. But Douglas was faster, his human reflexes allowing him to slip out of the Krenim's grasp and deliver a devastating series of blows. They fought back and forth across the lab, smashing through equipment and sending sparks flying. The nullifier changed hands again and again, each combatant desperate to claim the deadly device. Douglas ducked under a wild swing from Zarthax, then surged upward, his fist connecting with the Krenim's jaw with a satisfying crack. Zarthax staggered back, his cybernetic eye flickering. Seizing his chance, Douglas lunged forward, his hands closing around the quantum nullifier. He wrenched it free from Zarthax's grasp, then delivered a final crushing blow to the scientist's temple. Zarthax crumpled to the ground, his cybernetic eye going dark. Douglas stood over him, the nullifier held tight in his grip. He was battered and bleeding, but victorious. Corax hurried to his side, his eyes wide with awe. "You did it," he breathed. "You defeated Zarthax." Douglas nodded, his gaze fixed on the nullifier. "Not just me," he said. "We did it, but this thing, it's too dangerous. We need to destroy it." Corax hesitated, then nodded. "You're right, the galaxy isn't ready for this kind of power. No one should have it." Together, they turned to face the nullifier, ready to put an end to its threat once and for all. But as Douglas raised the device, preparing to smash it against the ground, a sudden thought struck him. The Galactic Council had sent him to retrieve the nullifier, not destroy it. They wanted this power for themselves, to use as they saw fit. Could he trust them with such a terrible weapon? Douglas hesitated, torn between his duty and his conscience. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance, and the choice he made now would shape its future for generations to come. As Douglas and Zarthax grappled for control of the quantum nullifier, their hands locked around the device in a desperate struggle. A stray finger accidentally brushed against the activation switch. The nullifier hummed to life, its core pulsing with an ominous green glow. Suddenly, a blinding flash of energy erupted from the device, engulfing the lab in a sickly green light. The very fabric of reality began to warp and distort around them, the air shimmering like a heat haze. The cybernetically enhanced Krenim warriors, caught in the localized quantum distortion, jerked and spasmed as their circuitry went haywire. They turned on each other in a frenzy of sparking metal and flailing limbs, their programming corrupted by the nullifier's energy. At the same time, the containment tanks lining the walls of the lab shattered under the strain of the distortion, releasing the grotesque, half-formed creatures within. The abominations, twisted and deformed by Zarthax's experiments, stumbled forth on misshapen limbs, their cries echoing through the chaos. Douglas, his face bathed in the sickly green glow of the nullifier, gritted his teeth and wrenched the device from Zarthax's grasp. The Krenim scientist, his cybernetic eye flickering erratically, howled in rage and lunged at Douglas, his fingers clawing for the nullifier. But Douglas was faster. He sidestepped Zarthax's attack and, with a swift motion, pulled the quantum key from his belt. He slammed the key into the nullifier's control panel, twisting it sharply. The device shuddered in his hands, the green glow fading as the quantum distortion began to dissipate. Around them, the lab was in ruins. The malfunctioning warriors lay in sparking heaps, their mechanical limbs twitching feebly. The escaped creatures, caught in the crossfire of the warriors' self-destruction, lay still and lifeless on the floor. Corax, his face streaked with sweat and grime, called out to Douglas over the din of groaning metal and hissing steam. "We have to get out of here," he shouted, his voice hoarse with desperation. "The lab's structure is failing. It's going to collapse any second." Douglas nodded, his gaze sweeping the room for an exit. But as he turned to run, a massive beam dislodged by the quantum distortion crashed down from the ceiling, pinning Zarthax to the floor. The Krenim scientist screamed in pain, his legs crushed beneath the twisted metal. For a moment Douglas hesitated, his instincts warring within him. Every fiber of his being urged him to run, to leave Zarthax to his fate and save himself. But something held him back. A flicker of humanity, perhaps, or a sense of duty to the mission. With a growl of frustration, Douglas turned back and grabbed the edge of the beam. His muscles strained as he heaved upward, his enhanced strength barely enough to lift the massive weight. Beside him, Corax added his own strength to the effort, his face contorted with exertion. Together, they managed to raise the beam just enough for Douglas to drag Zarthax free. The Krenim scientist, his face pale with pain, looked up at Douglas with a mixture of confusion and grudging respect. There was no time for words. Douglas hauled Zarthax to his feet, slinging the scientist's arm over his shoulder. With Corax leading the way, they staggered out of the collapsing lab, dodging falling debris and sparking wires. They burst out into the corridor just as the lab imploded behind them, a rush of heat and flame chasing at their heels. The force of the blast slammed into their backs, sending them sprawling to the floor. Douglas rolled to his feet, his ears ringing and his vision blurred. He shook his head to clear it, then reached down to help Corax and Zarthax to their feet. But as they stood, a contingent of Krenim soldiers rounded the corner, their weapons trained on the trio. Douglas tensed, his hand reaching for his blaster. Beside him, Corax raised his hands in surrender, his face tight with fear. The soldiers, however, lowered their weapons as they took in the scene. Zarthax, broken and defeated, hung limply in Douglas's grasp, while the quantum nullifier, now inert, dangled from the human's other hand. The lead soldier, his armor scorched and dented, stepped forward cautiously. "What happened here?" he demanded, his gaze flicking from Douglas to Zarthax and back again. Douglas met the soldier's gaze unflinchingly. "Zarthax has been stopped," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "His plan to use the nullifier to destroy the Council and establish Krenim dominance has failed." The soldier's eyes widened, then narrowed. He turned to Zarthax, his expression hardening. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice thick with disgust. Zarthax, his face twisted with pain and defeat, could only nod. "I did what I thought was best for our people," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the hiss of settling debris. "But I see now that I was wrong." Douglas, his jaw tight with anger, turned to the soldier. "I must contact the Council immediately," he said, his voice brooking no argument. "Zarthax must be extradited to face justice for his crimes." The soldier hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He gestured to his men, who stepped forward to take Zarthax into custody. The Krenim scientist, his shoulders slumped in defeat, offered no resistance as they led him away. As the Krenim soldiers led the defeated Zarthax away, Douglas stood in the ruins of the space station, the inert quantum nullifier still clutched in his hand. Corax approached him, his face a mix of relief and concern. "What now?" the young scientist asked, his voice trembling slightly. Before Douglas could respond, his communicator crackled to life. "Douglas, this is Korvac. We have an urgent situation." Douglas raised the device to his lips. "Go ahead, Korvac. I've secured the nullifier, and Zarthax is in custody." "I'm afraid that's not the end of it," Korvac said, his voice grave. "We've just received intel that Zarthax had a fail-safe plan. He's activated a network of sleeper agents, the Quantum Ravagers, each armed with a miniature quantum nullifier." Douglas's grip tightened on the communicator. "What's their target?" "Strategic locations across multiple systems. And there's more. They're also targeting the homeworlds of Council races. You need to hunt them down and neutralize them before they can strike." Corax stepped forward. "I'll help. I know Zarthax's methods. I can be useful." Douglas nodded. "We'll need all the help we can get. Send me the coordinates of the first Ravager sighting, Korvac." "Transmitting now. Your first target is on Solaris Station, a major trade hub. A Ravager was spotted there recently. Good luck, Douglas. The fate of the galaxy is in your hands." The transmission ended, and Douglas turned to Corax. "Let's move. We don't have much time." They raced back to the Phantom, Douglas's mind already racing with strategies and contingencies. As the ship blasted away from the ruined station, he pulled up the data on Solaris Station. It was a bustling hub of activity, with ships from 100 different races coming and going at all hours. Finding one Ravager among the crowds would be like searching for a needle in a haystack. But Douglas was not one to back down from a challenge. He would hunt this Ravager down and all the others, no matter what it took. As the Phantom dropped out of hyperspace near Solaris Station, Douglas immediately noticed something was wrong. Ships were fleeing the station in droves, and energy weapons fire lit up the void. As they landed, the scene that greeted them was one of chaos. Panicked civilians rushed to evacuate, while the station's security forces were locked in a tense standoff with a heavily augmented Krenim cyborg. "That must be our Ravager," Korax said, his eyes wide with fear. He approached the standoff, his hand resting on the hilt of his plasma pistol. The cyborg, noticing his approach, swung its gaze towards him. Its eyes glowed an eerie red, and its metallic limbs hummed with power. "Stand down," Douglas called out, his voice calm and authoritative. "This doesn't have to end in violence." The cyborg laughed, a harsh grating sound. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, human. I am Thrax, and I will not be stopped." With a snarl, Thrax lunged forward, his cybernetic arm morphing into a vicious-looking blade. Douglas reacted instantly, dodging the blow and drawing his pistol in one smooth motion. The two clashed in a flurry of strikes and parries, Douglas's enhanced reflexes barely keeping him ahead of Thrax's relentless assault. Around them, the station's security forces opened fire, their energy bolts sizzling through the air. But Thrax seemed to shrug off the hits, his armor absorbing the energy with ease. He pressed his attack, driving Douglas back with a series of lightning-fast strikes. Douglas gritted his teeth, his mind racing for a solution. He couldn't match Thrax's raw strength, but he had other advantages. His gaze fell on the cyborg's arm, where a small, glowing device was embedded. The miniaturized quantum nullifier. With a sudden burst of speed, Douglas lunged forward, his hand outstretched. His fingers closed around the device, and with a desperate yank, he tore it free from Thrax's arm. The cyborg howled in rage and pain, his attacks becoming even more frenzied. But without the nullifier, he was vulnerable. Douglas pressed his advantage, hammering at Thrax's defenses until, with a final devastating blow, he sent the cyborg crashing to the ground. Douglas stood over the fallen Ravager, his chest heaving with exertion. Korax hurried to his side, his face pale. But Douglas shook his head. "This is just the beginning. We need to find out what he knows." He knelt beside Thrax, his hand hovering over the cyborg's sparking arm. "Talk. What's your plan? What are the other targets?" Thrax coughed, a trickle of blood running from the corner of his mouth. "You're too late," he rasped. "The Ravagers are already in position. We will strike at the heart of the Council, and their precious homeworlds will burn." Douglas's blood ran cold. If the Ravagers succeeded, the galaxy would be plunged into chaos. Billions would die. He stood, his jaw set with resolve. "Korax, get a security team to lock this bastard down. We need to move now. If we can uncover the identities and locations of the other Ravagers, we might still have a chance to stop this." As Korax rushed off to organize the security teams, Douglas stared out at the stars, his mind racing with the magnitude of the task before them. The Council had placed their trust in him, and he would not fail. No matter the cost, he would hunt down the Ravagers and put an end to their devastating plan. The fate of the galaxy depended on it. As the Phantom rocketed through hyperspace, Douglas pored over the data they had extracted from Thrax. The Ravagers' cybernetic implants had contained a wealth of information, including the identities and locations of his fellow agents. "Zek, Luminarian homeworld of Lux Prime," Douglas read aloud, his brow furrowed. "Korax, what do you know about Lux Prime?" The young Krenim scientist looked up from his console. "It's a highly advanced world, known for its cutting-edge technology. The Luminarians have a vast network of AIs that control nearly every aspect of their society." "It would be catastrophic," Korax finished. "He could bring the entire planet to its knees." The Phantom dropped out of hyperspace, the brilliant light of Lux Prime's star filling the view screen. But as they approached the planet, it became clear that something was wrong. The planet's surface was dark, its usual luminescent glow replaced by an eerie, pulsing red. Ships fled the planet in droves, their hulls scorched and battered. "We're too late," Korax breathed. "Zek's already made his move." Douglas shook his head. "Not if I have anything to say about it." They landed on the outskirts of the capital city, the streets deserted and silent. The only sound was the distant thrum of machinery, a discordant beat that set Douglas's teeth on edge. Suddenly, a group of figures emerged from the shadows. They were luminarians, their usually ethereal forms flickering and distorted. Their eyes glowed the same eerie red as the planet's surface. "Zek's reprogrammed them," Korak said, his voice tight with fear. The luminarians attacked, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. Douglas and Korax fought back, their weapons flashing in the dim light. Finally, they reached the entrance to the Central AI's control center. The massive doors were sealed shut, guarded by a phalanx of reprogrammed luminarian drones. Douglas and Korax exchanged a glance. This was it, the final push. With a wordless battle cry, they charged forward, weapons blazing. The drones fell before them, sparking and twitching as they hit the ground. They burst into the control center, ready for anything. But what they saw made even Douglas's battle-hardened heart skip a beat. Zek stood at the center of a web of pulsing, glowing lines, his arms outstretched as he manipulated the planet's AI network. His eyes were closed, a look of twisted ecstasy on his face. "Zek!" Douglas shouted, his voice echoing in the cavernous chamber. The Ravager's eyes snapped open and he grinned, a feral, manic expression. "You're too late, human. The destabilization process has already begun. In a matter of hours, this planet will be nothing but a cloud of dust and debris." Douglas raised his blaster, but Zek just laughed. The Ravager's body began to glow, energy coursing through his cybernetic implants. "He's merged with the AI," Korak said, his voice trembling. "He's become part of the network." Douglas gritted his teeth. "Then we'll just have to take the network down." He charged at Zek, dodging the bolts of energy the Ravager hurled at him. They clashed in a flurry of blows. Douglas's combat training pitted against Zek's cybernetically enhanced strength. Behind them, Korax raced to the control console, his fingers flying over the keys as he worked to regain control of the AI. Douglas landed a crushing blow to Zek's jaw, sending the Ravager staggering back. But Zek just laughed, wiping a trickle of blood from his chin. "It doesn't matter if you defeat me," he sneered. "The destabilization process is irreversible, and even if you stop it here, my fellow Ravagers will succeed on the Saurian and Kreenim homeworlds. The Council will fall, and a new order will rise from the ashes." Douglas's eyes narrowed. He lunged at Zek, grappling with the Ravager in a desperate attempt to rip the quantum nullifier from his chest. The device came free with a shower of sparks, and Zek howled in pain. Douglas crushed the nullifier beneath his boot, grinding it into dust. At the same moment, Korax let out a triumphant shout. "I've done it! I've regained control of the AI." The pulsing red glow began to fade, replaced by the luminarian's usual soft light. The planet was safe for now. But Douglas's mind was already racing ahead. The Saurian and Kreenim homeworlds were still in danger, and time was running out. He turned to Korax, his jaw set with determination. "We have to split up. You take the Saurian homeworld, I'll handle the Kreenim. We'll coordinate our attacks and take these bastards down." As the ship blasted off into the stars, Douglas felt a grim sense of purpose settle over him. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance, and failure was not an option. The Phantom screamed through hyperspace, racing against the clock. Douglas's knuckles were white on the controls, his mind focused on the task ahead. The Kreenim homeworld loomed before them, a planet of towering spires and gleaming metal. But as they approached, Douglas could see the signs of Ravager activity. Smoke billowed from the planet's surface, and the space around it was littered with the debris of shattered ships. The Kreenim fleet was in disarray, their formations scattered and broken. Douglas gritted his teeth. They were too late. The Ravager had already begun their attack. But he wasn't about to give up, not now, not ever. The Phantom dove towards the planet's surface, weaving through the chaos of battle. Douglas's eyes scanned the ground, searching for any sign of the Ravager's location. There, a massive energy signature, coming from the heart of the Kreenim capital. That had to be where the Ravager was holed up. Douglas set the Phantom down in a crumbling plaza, the once proud statues of Krenim heroes reduced to rubble. He leaped from the ship, his blaster in hand, and sprinted towards the source of the energy signature. The streets were choked with debris and the bodies of fallen Krenim soldiers. Douglas pushed on, his heart pounding in his chest. He rounded a corner and skidded to a halt, his eyes widening at the sight before him. The Krenim soldier stood at the center of a swirling vortex of energy, his body writhing as the power of the quantum nullifier coursed through him. His eyes glowed with a sickly green light, and his face was twisted in a rictus of pain and ecstasy. "You're too late, human," the Ravager snarled, his voice distorted by the energy flowing through him. "The nullifier is already primed. In a matter of minutes, this planet will be nothing but dust." Douglas raised his blaster, but the Ravager just laughed. The energy vortex around him pulsed and expanded, knocking Douglas off his feet. Douglas charged at the Ravager, ducking and weaving through the swirling energy. He could feel it crackling against his skin, setting his nerves on fire. But he pushed through the pain, his focus narrowing to a single point, the quantum nullifier pulsing at the center of the Ravager's chest. Douglas lunged, his hand closing around the device. The Ravager screamed, his body convulsing as Douglas ripped the nullifier free. The energy vortex collapsed, and the Ravager crumpled to the ground, his body smoking and twitching. Douglas stood over him, the nullifier clutched in his hand. It was over. They had won. But even as the thought crossed his mind, his communicator crackled to life. "Douglas," Corax's voice was tight with fear. "The Saurian homeworld, I was too late. The Ravager activated the nullifier. The planet is tearing itself apart." Douglas felt his heart sink. They had stopped the Krenim Ravager, but at what cost? He closed his eyes, his grip tightening on the nullifier. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. And as he stood amidst the ruins of the Krenim capital, Douglas knew that the hardest fights were yet to come. As the ship hurtled towards the Saurian homeworld of Sauria Prime, Douglas's mind raced with the information Corax had provided about the planet. It was a world of dense jungles and ancient ruins, steeped in the mysteries of a long-forgotten past. But now that past had come back to haunt the Saurians in the form of Crater, a ruthless quantum ravager who had seized control of an ancient superweapon known as the Solar Hammer, the massive orbital platform, capable of harnessing the power of the system's sun, could incinerate the planet's surface in a matter of minutes. The Phantom shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, the lush green orb of Sauria Prime filling the viewscreen. Douglas's eyes narrowed as he spotted the Solar Hammer, a gleaming speck against the backdrop of the planet's swirling clouds. He brought the ship in fast and low, skimming over the jungle canopy as he approached the platform's coordinates. A burst of anti-aircraft fire erupted from the platform's surface, scarlet bolts sizzling past the Phantom's hull. Douglas gritted his teeth and jinked the ship hard to starboard, avoiding the worst of the barrage. He brought the Phantom in close to the platform's surface, searching for a landing site. There, a small landing pad nestled between two towering spires. Douglas brought the ship down hard, the landing gear slamming into the platform's metal surface. He was out of the ship in seconds, his blaster in hand. A team of Saurian special forces, their scales glistening in the harsh light of the platform's artificial sun, fell into step beside him. Together they moved towards the Solar Hammer's control center, a looming structure at the heart of the platform. Douglas could feel the heat of the artificial sun on his face, a searing reminder of the weapon's destructive potential. As they approached the control center's entrance, a hail of blaster fire erupted from the shadows. Crater's loyal followers, their eyes gleaming with fanatical devotion, poured out of the structure's depths. Douglas and the Saurians dove for cover, returning fire as they went. The air was thick with the stench of ozone and burning flesh, the platform's metal surface slick with blood. They pushed forward, inch by hard-fought inch, the Saurians' superior numbers and Douglas's unmatched skill turning the tide of battle. Finally, they stood before the control center's massive blast doors, the bodies of Crater's followers littering the ground around them. Douglas stepped forward, his blaster leveled at the doors. He nodded to the Saurian commander, a grizzled veteran with a scar running down the length of his snout. The commander input a series of commands into a nearby control panel, and the blast doors slid open with a hiss of hydraulics. Douglas stepped inside, the Saurians fanning out behind him. The control center was a cavernous space, filled with pulsing consoles and flickering holographic displays, and there, at the center of it all, stood Crater. The Saurian Ravager was a towering figure, his scales a mottled green and his eyes gleaming with malevolent intelligence. He held a massive energy blade in one clawed hand, the weapon's hilt carved with intricate runes. "So the Council sends its lapdog to stop me," Crater hissed, his forked tongue flicking out to taste the air. "You're too late, human. The solar hammer's firing sequence has already begun. In a matter of minutes, this world will burn." Douglas raised his blaster, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Not if I have anything to say about it." Crater laughed, a harsh grating sound. "You are welcome to try, human, but you will fail just as the Council has failed to stop the quantum ravagers." With a snarl, the Saurian lunged forward, his energy blade slicing through the air. Douglas rolled to the side, the blade missing him by inches. He came up firing, his blaster bolt sizzling against Crater's personal shield. The Saurian responded with a barrage of his own, the control center erupting into a maelstrom of energy and flying debris. Douglas ducked and weaved, his enhanced reflexes keeping him one step ahead of Crater's attacks. But the Saurian was relentless, his strength and speed far beyond that of a normal being. Across the control center, the Saurian Special Forces clashed with Crater's remaining followers, the room echoing with the sounds of battle. Douglas could hear the solar hammer's systems powering up around him, the weapon's activation sequence ticking down with every passing second. He gritted his teeth and launched himself at Crater, his fist connecting with the Saurian's jaw with a satisfying crack. Crater staggered back, his shield flickering. Douglas pressed his advantage, raining blows down on the Ravager with all the strength and skill he could muster. Crater fought back viciously, his claws and energy blade seeking any weakness in Douglas's defense. The two warriors clashed back and forth across the control center, their battle a dance of death amid the chaos of the solar hammer's activation. Douglas could feel his strength waning, his body battered and bruised from the relentless assault. But he pushed on, driven by the knowledge that the fate of an entire world rested on his shoulders. With a final, desperate lunge, he slammed his fist into Crater's chest, the blow shattering the Saurian's shield and sending him flying across the room. Crater slammed into a nearby console, his body convulsing as electricity surged through his system. The Saurian slumped to the ground, his eyes growing dim. Douglas staggered to the solar hammer's control panel, his fingers flying over the keys as he worked to abort the firing sequence. The countdown ticked down before him, the seconds slipping away like grains of sand in an hourglass. With a final triumphant keystroke, Douglas slammed his hand down on the override button. The solar hammer shuddered beneath his feet, its systems powering down with a whine of dissipating energy. He had done it. Sauria Prime was safe, its people spared from the horrors of the quantum ravager's twisted plan. But even as relief washed over him, Douglas's thoughts turned to Corax and the battle that was surely raging on the Krenim homeworld. He could only hope that his friend was faring better than he had, and that together they could put an end to the quantum ravager threat once and for all. On the Krenim homeworld of Kronos, Corax raced through the winding streets of the planet's capital city, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the temporal anomalies created by Zora's tampering with the planet's temporal displacement network, the very fabric of space-time twisting and warping around him. He dodged a cascade of collapsing masonry as a nearby building flickered in and out of existence, its structure unable to withstand the strain of the temporal distortions. Overhead, the sky roiled with unnatural colors, lightning crackling through clouds that shifted and changed with every passing moment. Corax gritted his teeth and pushed on, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the chaos that engulfed him. Zora's plan was as brilliant as it was insane. By manipulating the temporal displacement network, she could erase the council races from history itself, rewriting the very fabric of reality to suit her twisted desires. Corax rounded a corner and skidded to a halt, his eyes widening at the sight before him. Zora stood at the center of a swirling vortex of temporal energy, her body writhing with the power of the displacement network. Her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and her laughter echoed through the streets like the tolling of a funeral bell. Around her, the city shifted and changed, buildings and streets blinking in and out of existence as the temporal anomalies tore at the fabric of reality. Corax could see the faces of the Krenim people in the flickering images, their expressions contorted in terror and confusion as their world unraveled around them. Zora turned to face him, her lips curled in a sneer. "You're too late, Corax. The displacement network is already under my control. Soon the council races will be nothing more than a forgotten memory, erased from the annals of history." Corax shook his head, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. "I won't let you do this, Zora. The consequences of tampering with time itself are too great. You could unravel the very fabric of the universe." Zora laughed, a sound that sent chills down Corax's spine. "You lack vision, Corax. With the power of the displacement network at my fingertips, I can reshape reality itself. I can create a universe where the Krenim reign supreme, where the Council and its pathetic allies are nothing more than dust beneath our feet." Corax's grip tightened on his blaster, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he had only one chance to stop Zora before it was too late. With a wordless cry of defiance, he charged forward, his blaster spitting crimson bolts of energy at the swirling vortex that surrounded the Krenim Ravager. The bolts sizzled and vanished as they hit the temporal distortions, swallowed up by the chaotic energies that held Zora in their grip. Zora laughed, her voice rising in pitch as the power of the displacement network surged through her body. She raised a hand, and a bolt of pure temporal energy lanced out towards Corax, searing the air with its passage. Corax rolled to the side, the bolt missing him by inches. He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing as he tried to find a way through Zora's defenses. And then he saw it. A flicker of instability in the temporal vortex, a momentary weakness in the chaotic energies that surrounded Zora. If he could just disrupt that point, maybe he could break her connection to the displacement network and end her mad scheme. Corax took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had only one shot at this, and he knew the risks. If he miscalculated, if he was even a fraction of a second off, he could be torn apart by the temporal energies, or worse, erased from history altogether. But he had to try. For the sake of the Krenim people, for the sake of the entire galaxy, he had to stop Zora. With a final defiant roar, Corax charged forward, his blaster forgotten as he hurled himself into the heart of the temporal vortex. He felt the energies tearing at his body, felt his very essence being ripped apart and scattered across the infinite expanse of space and time. But he pushed on, his will unbreakable, his determination unwavering. He reached out with every fiber of his being, his fingertips brushing against the point of instability in the vortex. And with a blinding flash of light and a deafening roar of sound, the temporal vortex collapsed, the displacement network's energies dissipating like smoke on the wind. Zora screamed in agony and rage as the power that had sustained her was ripped away, her body convulsing as the temporal distortions that had ravaged the city began to unravel around her. Corax fell to his knees, his body battered and broken by the forces he had unleashed, but as he looked up at the sky above, he saw that it had returned to its normal hue, the lightning and swirling clouds gone as if they had never been. He had done it. Against all odds, he had stopped Zora and saved his people from the Ravager's twisted plan. But as he struggled to his feet, his gaze falling on the crumpled form of Zora, he knew that the battle was far from over. The quantum Ravagers were still out there, their plans for galactic domination far from thwarted. And he knew that he and Douglas would have to stand together, united in their determination to protect the innocent and safeguard the future of the galaxy, no matter the cost. Corax raced through the streets of Kronos, his heart pounding in his chest as he navigated the temporal anomalies that twisted and warped the fabric of reality around him. The once familiar cityscape shifted and changed before his eyes, buildings and monuments blinking in and out of existence as Zora's manipulations of the temporal displacement network took hold. He ducked into a narrow alleyway, barely avoiding a flickering rift that threatened to engulf him. As he caught his breath, Corax's eyes widened in horror at the scene that unfolded before him. The alleyway had transformed into a nightmarish vision of a future where the Kreenim Empire reigned supreme. Towering statues of Kreenim warriors loomed over the streets, their faces twisted in cruel triumph. Banners bearing the Kreenim insignia fluttered in the breeze, and the once vibrant alien districts of the city lay in ruins, their inhabitants reduced to cowering shadows. Corax shook his head, trying to clear the vision from his mind. He knew that this was just one of the many pockets of altered history that Zora had created, a glimpse into a future that could never be allowed to come to pass. Using his intimate knowledge of Kreenim technology, Corax navigated the temporal labyrinth, staying one step ahead of Zora's traps and pitfalls. He ducked and weaved through the shifting streets, his mind racing as he tried to calculate the fastest route to the displacement network's control center. Finally, he arrived at the heart of the network, a vast chamber filled with pulsing conduits and flickering displays. And there at the center of it all stood Zora, her face twisted in a triumphant sneer. "You're too late, Corax," she gloated, her voice echoing through the chamber. "The displacement network is under my control, and soon the Galactic Council will be nothing more than a forgotten footnote in history." Corax's eyes narrowed, his hand tightening around the prototype temporal stabilizer he had been developing in secret. "I won't let you destroy everything we've worked for, Zora," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos that raged around them. Zora laughed, a harsh, grating sound that sent chills down Corax's spine. "And what do you think you can do to stop me?" she asked, gesturing to the temporal distortion fields that surrounded her. "I hold the power of time itself in my hands." Corax took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. "You may have the power of the network," he said, "but I have something you don't." With a flick of his wrist, he activated the temporal stabilizer, the device humming to life in his hand. A localized field of energy erupted from the stabilizer, washing over the chamber and cancelling out Zora's distortions. The temporal anomalies that had twisted the fabric of reality began to unravel, the altered pockets of history fading away like mist in the morning sun. Zora's eyes widened in shock and rage as she realized what was happening. "No!" she screamed, lunging at Corax with murder in her eyes. "You can't do this!" But Corax was ready for her. Using the advanced combat training he had received during his time with the Galactic Council, he sidestepped Zora's attack and countered with a series of swift, precise strikes. The two scientists clashed in a desperate battle, their bodies a blur of motion as they fought for control of the displacement network. Around them, the chamber shook and shuddered, the temporal anomalies growing more severe with each passing moment. Corax could feel the strain on his body as he fought, his muscles burning with exertion, but he pushed through the pain, driven by the knowledge that the fate of the entire galaxy hung in the balance. With a final desperate lunge, he caught Zora off guard, his fist connecting with her jaw in a crushing blow. The Kreenim scientist staggered back, her eyes rolling back in her head as she crumpled to the floor. Corax stood over her, his chest heaving with exertion. He could feel the temporal stabilizer's field beginning to weaken, the device pushed to its limits by the sheer magnitude of the anomalies it was trying to contain. He knew he had only moments before the field collapsed entirely, and the displacement network's power was unleashed once more. With a final, desperate effort, he lunged for the network's control console, his fingers flying over the keys as he worked to shut down the system and restore the timeline to its original state. The chamber shook and shuddered around him, the temporal anomalies growing more and more severe with each passing second. But Corax didn't falter, his focus laser-sharp as he poured every ounce of his knowledge and skill into the task at hand. And then, with a final triumphant keystroke, it was over. The displacement network powered down with a whine of dissipating energy, the temporal anomalies fading away into nothingness. Korax sagged against the console, his body battered and bruised but his spirit unbroken. He had done it. Against all odds, he had stopped Zora and saved the galaxy from the quantum ravager's twisted machinations. With trembling fingers, he activated his communicator, his voice hoarse with exhaustion as he sent a message to Douglas. "It's done," he said, a weary smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Zora has been defeated, and the timeline is restored. The quantum ravager threat is over." As he spoke, Korax could feel the weight of the galaxy's fate lifting from his shoulders. There would be time to rest later, to heal, and to reflect on all that had happened, but for now, there was still work to be done. The Phantom glided into the Galactic Council's grand docking bay, the sleek ship reflecting the ethereal light of the surrounding starscape. As the vessel settled onto the landing pad, a crowd of dignitaries from various council races gathered to greet the returning heroes. Douglas and Korax emerged from the ship, their faces etched with the weariness of their hard-fought battles. The assembled council members erupted into applause, their voices rising in a cacophony of praise and gratitude. Korvac, the towering Krenim leader, stepped forward, his compound eyes glistening with emotion. "Douglas, Korax," he began, his voice booming through the chamber, "your bravery and sacrifice have saved countless lives and preserved the very fabric of our galactic society. The Council is forever in your debt." Douglas nodded, his jaw tight with exhaustion. "We did what needed to be done," he said simply, his gaze sweeping over the gathered crowd. As the council members led Douglas and Korax into the heart of the chamber, whispers began to circulate among the assembled dignitaries. Talk of granting humanity a seat on the council, of elevating their status from a primitive species to a respected member of the galactic community, rippled through the room. But before the discussions could gain momentum, an urgent transmission cut through the chamber, silencing the gathered throng. On the massive view screen, a haggard and panicked luminarian appeared, his ethereal form flickering with distress. "Esteemed council members," the luminarian gasped, his voice trembling, "a grave threat has emerged. Zarthax, the Krenim scientist believed to have perished, has resurfaced. He has acquired a weapon of unimaginable power, a singularity bomb capable of creating a black hole that could consume entire star systems." The chamber erupted into chaos, the council members shouting over one another in a frenzy of fear and confusion. Douglas and Korax exchanged a grim look, their momentary respite shattered by the weight of this new revelation. The luminarian continued, his words punctuated by the urgent beeping of warning systems. "Zarthax has issued an ultimatum. He demands that the Council surrender control to him, or he will unleash the singularity bomb on a heavily populated system. You have mere hours to comply." As the transmission ended, the chamber fell into a stunned silence. The weight of Zarthax's threat hung heavy in the air, the once celebratory mood replaced by a palpable sense of dread. Douglas stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I'll stop him," he said, his words ringing with a grim determination. "I'll assemble a team and confront Zarthax, no matter the cost. This galaxy will not bow to the whims of a madman." Korvac nodded, his compound eyes glinting with a mix of fear and resolve. "The Council stands behind you, Douglas. You will have our full support and resources. May the stars guide you to victory." As Douglas turned to leave the chamber, Korax fell into step beside him, his face set with the same unwavering determination. Together they set out to gather their team, each step bringing them closer to the final confrontation that would decide the fate of the galaxy. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.